So we're going to switch right away here into the next session, and I'm going to invite my colleague up, Dori Gingera-Boschman, who is the Deputy Minister of Manitoba Agriculture, and has been one of the minds behind the architecture of public trust strategy in agriculture, along with people like Kim McConnell and Chantal Donahue. So Dori is going to be the moderator for this next panel, and we have, I think, one coming on virtually for this panel, and then I'd like to invite the other panel members up to talk about informing consumers and building trust in animal protein sustainability. So a great segue from the Protein Pact presentation. So thank you.
Hey everyone, nice to see you all. Morris is trying to keep us awake by buggering around with the program all the time. So there you go, you never know who's up next. Anyhow, one of the sessions that the topic has been referred to all day, and that's the element of public trust. And so it's both a art and a science. And so we've got 4 folks, 3 in person, and I think Jennifer is coming on over the screen, that is going to give us a little bit of a background on their role and their experience and where they come from perspective on public trust. That's not going to take too long because we suspect that there's going to be a number of questions on this one. So we're going to do a little bit of, they're going to introduce themselves right from the chair, talk a little bit about their experience in public trust, and then we're going to open it up for questions. So get your questions ready. So I'm going to start with Andrea. She was up here before. This is her second go around. And so I'm going to let Andrea introduce herself. I've known Andrea since she was about 3. And so if she doesn't do a good job on public trust, ask her to do some Scottish dancing because she's really kind of fabulous at it. Anyhow, I told you, Andrea, I wouldn't do this, but there you go, I did. Anyhow, go ahead, Andrea.
That might not be the most embarrassing thing you know about me. So you've all heard from me, I think, most of you this morning, so I won't go into too much intro, but I am the Director of Marketing and Stakeholder Relations for the Canadian Roundtable for Sustainable Beef. And we were established back in 2014, and really we're about measuring, communicating, and advancing continuous improvement in sustainability of the Canadian beef value chain. So we've got 4 pillars of work, and one of those is communication and engagement. And so what I was just going to talk about today is a little bit about our consumer research that we do, and hopefully it doesn't either conflict or overlap what John's going to say. So part of that role is looking at what consumer perceptions are of the beef industry, of beef producers, and what we're doing in terms of sustainability. So we did our first study in 2018, another one in 2019, and then we had committed to do it about every 2 years, but we took a little bit of a longer hiatus because of the pandemic, the dreaded C word. So we did our latest study earlier this year, in March of this year. And so, again, just looking at consumer perceptions of beef sustainability specifically, we looked at kind of people's sustainability, their lifestyles and their habits, consumption habits, some of their industry impressions, and then some specifics on sustainability. So I thought I'd just share a couple of little highlights from our results. And just I think over the last number of years, we've seen a really big shift in people trying to incorporate sustainability into their overall lifestyle. And in particular, of course, in their food choices. I think that's a big part of where people think that they can make that impact. We asked about some of their individual actions and what they think, from a list, and we did include reducing meat consumption in that list. I don't know, maybe surprisingly, it was fairly down low at the bottom, so that was a surprisingly positive thing. But really the top 3 were all about waste and recycling and some of those kind of options. So that's good to see that that's where people think that they can make a personal choice in their everyday life. We looked at things like labeling and what people look for. And overall, what we found was that the industry impression in terms of the beef print industry, beef producers, is very high. We know that people over and over, and I think John's research will tell us that too, is that people really trust farmers and ranchers. So that's good, and I think we can lean into that. And hearing about the Protein Pack Communications Plan there, I think those are the stories that we can really lean into, and people trust those. And so if we can get more of those out there into the public sphere, I think that's a really good place to be. In terms of beef industry impression, with respect to sustainability, overall, 3/4 of Canadians think that we're doing things sustainably and are really committed to that continuous improvement. So that was really nice to see. And then the last thing I wanted to just touch on was, as I talked about this morning, the industry has set some 2030 fairly robust goals. So we took a few of those goals and asked Canadians what they think of them and if that changes their impression of the beef industry. So overwhelmingly, it was a positive reaction when we kind of laid out a few of those goals. We saw that people before and after had a really positive impression of the industry once hearing about them. So I think that just tells us that we're on the right track. And continuous improvement, as we know, it's a journey. There's no end point, and we just keep getting better and better. So that's, I think that I'll just stop there and let the next one talk.
I'm going to bring Jennifer in so we just don't leave her hanging out there, and then we'll come back to the stage. Go ahead, Jennifer. Why don't you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about the public trust part of Walmart?
Hi there. Thank you so much. Apologies for not being able to be there in person. I also apologize for those of you in the audience who have to see my giant head on the screen for the duration of this. I feel like that's enough of a stressor. But coming to you from the Greater Toronto area, we're having a little bit of snow, nothing like what you've got going on out there, but glad to know that everyone made it safe, and really congratulations to the conference organizers for being so agile and flexible. Really great. I work for Walmart Canada, so my role internally is to act as what I call an agitator in the sustainability space, and really talk to and work with all of our business units to kind of question, can we do things in a more regenerative or sustainable way, explaining to folks what that means, and really just sort of looking at what we do, keeping in mind, obviously we want to make sure we can further and continue to support the economy and make really well-educated decisions on what it means for Walmart to become more regenerative. You may have heard a quote from our president and CEO, Doug McMillon, from 2020, where basically he stood up and said, we're on a path to becoming a regenerative company, one dedicated to placing nature and humanity at the center of our business practices. And I think that's really what's at the heart of this discussion today, is that it's not just about nature, it's not just about people, it's how do we couple all of those things together to truly make well-informed decisions, not just on a purchasing and procurement side, but also to share that knowledge with our customer base. And so one of the things that we always get asked is, what does regeneration mean? Because it's sort of a take on sustainability, but it's a little bit bigger. So in Walmart, we look at it under 4 key pillars. We have an opportunity pillar, a sustainability pillar, community, and then ethics and integrity. So the work that I typically do falls into the quote unquote sustainability pillar. But what I would note really heavily here is my pillar, which would be things like waste and nature, climate, also includes people. So it's really the acknowledgement that Walmart or any one company or any one producer or individual player along the supply chain can't make this change or these changes on their own. And that it's really important to make sure that we're sharing out knowledge, sharing out value across the chain, and keeping kind of people, community at the heart of those decisions as well. So I think Andrea probably touched on it a little bit, and I think we're hearing some of the consumer sentiment of wanting to be more informed and wanting to be more aware of the work that's being done in all of these different areas. At Walmart, Obviously, we work closely with Andrea and the team at CRSB on some of our sustainable or more sustainable beef sourcing options. So working with farmers and ranchers who are certified through CRSB for some of those goals and commitments. And I think it's really great to see an industry such as the beef industry who are committed to that continuous improvement and knowing and recognizing, just like all of us, that we are on this journey and that it's great that we're doing the work. We also need to talk about it in a credible, meaningful way that consumers understand. Because, we can all think of the times we've been in a position to make a purchasing decision and not really necessarily known all of the information, or not known what does that mean, or what could that mean, or could I do this in a different way? And so it's things like these third-party certifications, really understanding, how do you build trust and how do you educate the consumer in a way that's not overwhelming. I find I have a tendency of doing that. I get way into the weeds. This is what I do every day, so I can get a little too granular, and I know it can be overwhelming. So it's how do we take the meaningful points and translate it into something that consumers understand and value and trust. And I think that's, it's something that we're all working as an industry to really build and do and work on. And we couldn't do those things without the folks that you see on the stage, folks that are in the audience, people asking those questions. I always bring up the role of the friendly critic. So one of the things that I enjoy working with folks like the CRSB and other NGOs in this space, I like the challenge. I like hearing, could you do this differently? What does this mean? How do you do this differently? Because I know it comes from a place of improvement, and it's not necessarily just a criticism. It's that friendly critic trying to further the cause, so to speak. But I could go into too many things on Walmart sourcing, but definitely some of our key highlights relate back to nature. We have a global commitment to protect, manage, or restore 50 million acres of land and 1 million square miles of ocean by 2030, and source 20 key commodities more sustainably by 2025. And again, can't stress enough that it's not just about the nature and biodiversity component. It's also about the people component, which is why we're also committed to accelerating economic opportunity for small scale suppliers through direct farming and inclusive sourcing practices and programs. And with that, I will stop talking and I will pass it along to the next person as well. Thank you so much for this opportunity as well.
Hey, thanks, Jennifer. I'm going to turn it over to Carrie now. Carrie?
Well, thank you very much. This is kind of new to me. I'm not new to the industry. My name is Carrie Toll, and I'm the Vice President of Industry and Government Relations for Safina Foods, which is one of Canada's largest meat processors. And I'm also the chair of the Canadian Meat Council. So I'm quite honored to be here. Even though I'm not a Manitoban, I share an affinity for your weather. And we're going down to minus 27 next week, so you're giving me a blast this week, so that's enjoyable. When we talk about public trust, I think it's interesting. In my previous roles, I've been a farmer, so we farmed beef and sheep and also turkeys. And then I came into the food processing, but I did a little stint in there where I was in politics, and I think there's only one there that you might think there was some trust issues with. In my role at Canadian Meat Council as chair, our association is very similar to NAMI, but they're much more advanced than us. We represent Canada's registered meat processors and packers and associated suppliers. The meat processing industry, packing, supplying industry is the largest component of the processing sector in the country, and we have annual sales of over 28 billion. So there's no question that we have a significant impact, but also a significant responsibility to consumers, to suppliers, to customers, and to producers on sustainability and making sure we're viable as we go forward. There are approximately 700 federally licensed meat production facilities in Canada, and our sector employs almost 70,000 people. And even with those 70,000 people, we're short on labor. So we're an opportunity to grow, to get bigger, and frankly, have a product that both our producers want us to process and our consumers want to eat. We feed people. In 2021, Canada produced approximately 2.2 million tons of pork. Most of that, 70% of that, was exported out to countries such as Japan and China. And also in the same year, 1.4 million tons of beef, which 50% of that was exported externally to Japan, China, Mexico, and other countries. I think there's a great opportunity to see us grow and to work in partnership and lockstep with our producers and our suppliers, and to have that product go across the world globally. There's no question that many countries desire Canadian meat because of its sustainability and its practices and how we grow and how we do that. I think that one of the things that we need to improve on, and certainly at CMC we acknowledge this, and in 2022 we commissioned a study on sustainability. It heavily focused on environmental sustainability, even though we know sustainability, much to my colleagues who've spoken already, is really social, economic, and environmental. But this study specifically focused on environment because within the processing sector, we didn't have a lot of knowledge of who was doing what, to what capacity, and how sustainable were you, whether you were small, medium, or large. So what the study found was interesting and positive, and it focused on 4 key factors. So the first one was water quality and quantity. The second one was air quality and GHG emissions, waste management, and energy reduction. And what the report was able to identify was that for the most part, the majority of the processors, packers, and suppliers within our association were actually engaged in either actively developed sustainability plans or in the process of updating and modernizing existing sustainability plans to meet the needs of today, or smaller members were accessing our larger members for mentorship on how to develop a viable sustainability plan. That was knowledge we didn't have before, and I think that is a huge positive for our industry. From there, what we were identified was one of the biggest metrics for processing is water management and usage. And as anybody knows, that in a processing facility of any size, whether you're small, medium, or large, the use of water is integral. So how do you use it responsibly? How do you manage it responsibly? And then what can you give back in terms of recycling, regeneration, and active updating and modernizing of your facilities to implement that? And in the report, it identified that the larger processors definitely had plans in place or identified areas of improvement and working directly with municipalities on how to reduce the amount of water waste and usage from the municipality through either recycling, regeneration, or those kinds of things. And then they could take those ideas and scale them to our smaller processors, which has been a huge benefit, because I think what we've heard significantly so far is that our smaller members, much like NAMI, don't have the resources or the ability or even the expertise sometimes to be able to engage them. GHG emissions, the documentation and the efforts to reduce GHG is a challenge, there's no question, but it is ongoing and certainly engaged. The majority of our members identified that they have processes in place. Our bigger members, certainly, as we heard from Maple Leaf today, when they put in their plan to meet carbon neutrality and then actually achieved it, that was a huge goal for our processing sector. So those set the bars for the next processors to go the extra mile to try and figure out how they can do it. But we can also share in that knowledge, and that's one of the things the Canadian Meat Council's objective is to allow a space where you can gather that information, not have it be heavily identifiable to any one company, but share that knowledge and the outcomes. Because it's one thing to say, we did X, but the reality of it is if you're reducing waste, you're reducing GHG emissions, utilities use, water use, there is an economic benefit to all of those things, but there's an economic capital cost to that. So we're able to show what the benefit is for those who have changed, but also what the potential is for the industry. So I think there's some really important activities. We certainly have been involved in the Protein Pact. We were heavily proud to endorse the NAMI Protein Pact, and we see it as something that could be implemented across Canada on a smaller scale, because we are smaller, but it's certainly something that we can work with and achieve to strive forward. Thank you.
Thanks, Gary. And John Jameson is next. John and I met at the deputy minister's table because we meet from a federal, provincial, territorial, and I sat beside John for many meetings, and actually some of the work around public trust really started around, at least from the government standpoint, started around that table. And then John took off, left the deputy minister's table, and is now at the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity, sort of is now implementing what as bureaucrats do, talk about the policy and the hopeful outcomes. So John, over to you.
Thanks, Dory. And hopefully my voice will hold out. I'm coming off a cold. But as Dory mentioned, I work for an organization called the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity. And it's a national nonprofit that's membership-based with support from Manitoba Agriculture and a number of other provinces and commodity groups and retail. And we have one purpose and one purpose only, and that's to build trust in the Canadian food system. So when you think about building trust in the food system, I think the first thing we have to think about is, how do we define trust? And the way we define trust is that it's the expectation that the food industry will act in an ethical way to meet the public's interest in producing food that is affordable, safe, available, and produced in a sustainable way. And you can build that trust. It sounds simple, but it's not. You do the right thing, which is what we're doing through our sustainability activities. You measure it through our assurance programs and your codes of practice and your measurements, and then you communicate it. And I think the communications piece is where we're starting to ramp up and do a better job of, but we need to do a better job. And when I was a deputy minister in government, I had this photo on the wall. And it was a young guy standing in a dairy barn. And people would come into my office that weren't necessarily connected to agriculture, and they'd look at this big photo and they'd say, "I love that photo." And I'd say, well, let's talk about this photo. The cows were tied up. Their tails were tied up. I actually keep them out of the poop. There was one little fan in the back. There was fluorescent lights. The ceiling, the guy was about 6'2", so the ceiling was not much above his head. And I'd say to folks, do you know what they've done to that barn since that photo was taken? They built a new one across the road. The new one, the cows are not tied up anymore. They walk around, they have scratching posts, they have cleaners, they have automatic feeders, they have robots, they have curtains that go up and down based on temperature, they have natural light, they have good air. And I said, if you were driving down the road and the old barn was on your right and the new barn across the road was on your left, which one would you gravitate to? People said, they would gravitate to the old style. That's the challenge we have in getting across the message of how modern agriculture supports food safety, food affordability, and how we need to get a message across around diversity, that there's room for everyone in our food production system. And then the third one is this path of continuous improvement, this sustainability piece. And we need to drive that home. And the best way to do it is to do it as a united system. So I like what you're doing, and the plant protein is working along step with the animal protein, that one organization isn't trying to one-up the other by building themselves up by tearing down the other. So we need to work as an industry to tell our story, but to tell it in a way that's engaging and recognizing that the public doesn't know a lot about modern food production. Our organization does a survey every year of about 3,000 Canadians, so we have a really robust base of information. One of the things we asked them a couple of years ago, what do you know about modern food production? 90% of Canadians said we know little or nothing, which is not unusual, because 1% of the people in Canada feed the other 38 million. They also said that 60% of them wanted to know more. So we have an opportunity to tell our story, and we need to do it united, and we need to do it as an industry, and we need to talk about how we're building on that path of continuous improvement. And it's not always about telling just the good things. It's about being authentic and sometimes saying, you know what, we're still trying to get this right, and that builds that authenticity. So I think everything I heard today, especially from the previous speaker, really hitting on the things that build trust. We know also from our research that 95% of Canadians are very comfortable eating milk, meat, eggs. They are very comfortable with animal protein, but they want to know that the animals have been looked after. They want to know what you're doing around climate. They want to know what you're doing around worker safety, and I think you're on the right path. That's my comments, Dory.
I'll buy you that drink later, John. No, sincerely, it really is kind of a great segue now to being able to open it up for questions. But I'd like to ask the first one, and we do know that the consumers have made, public trust a very popular concept now because they want to know. They want to know where it comes from, how it's produced, how workers are treated, and they want to know about environment and social sustainability. Our strategy is looking at being the preferred supplier of choice for sustainable animal and plant protein. But that preferred supplier of choice is not going to make it if we're not also the trusted supplier of choice as well. And so that whole interest in public trust has to be real. Eric, you were a perfect sort of segue into this conversation, because what the question I'm going to ask is, what steps are needed for all the actors, all the players in the animal protein sector, including farmers and processors and service providers and retailers, to build and maintain public trust? And as Eric said, to flip it from a defensive posture to a positive one. We do, are worried, especially if you're in the primary agriculture side of the industry, that we're going to be caught at an event. Somebody's going to ask us a hard question about the facts of the industry, and we won't know them all. And we're afraid that if we admit we don't know, that it's a negative thing, but it's not, it isn't. Far better to do that than to argue with the person who's asking the question, why do you need to know? Or the more insulting thing is to send them to a website and say, go figure it out. In this story, we have an opportunity to change the way people hear the message from us. So my question to my colleagues up here is, what steps do those actors, the farmers, the processors, the retailers, need to take in order to maintain and build public trust? So I'll start with you, John, and then work it backwards.
I think the first thing we need to do, and it's a confidence thing, is be damn proud of what you do. If you're proud of what you do, you can project a much more positive image. That'd be my first step. The next step, and there's actually, I shouldn't say this, but if you go on our website,
There we go.
there's actually a piece we have on there on the Canadian Centre for Food and Centre for Food Integrity. There's 7 steps to building trust, and they are motivation to do the right thing, to engage your stakeholders, as many people as possible, to disclose information, both good and bad, to share relevant information, to be clear, not be too complicated, because again, the public doesn't know a lot about our production. To be authentic, I like to say, it's not a bad thing to show our warts and stretch marks. No one's perfect. That's how you build authenticity, and be accurate. And also to anticipate that if someone is asking you a question, and I used to tell this to the politicians I work with, assume that they already know the answer.
Yeah.
Because if they wouldn't be asking the question if they didn't already know the answer. But the big piece is work as a united system. And I would focus on 3 ideas. 1, modern food production supports food safety, food affordability, and food security. Number 2, diversity. Number 3 is a path of continuous improvement. It's simple, but it's complicated.
Carrie?
So good comments, because I'm not, I would agree. I mean, we've done lots of work with the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity, and both Kim McConnell and Chantal have done an amazing amount of work. And if you can see any of those 2 speak, it's a moment in itself. I think there's, from a processing sector, from the Canadian Meat Council and our members' situation or positioning, I think part of the challenge that we have that we need to be better at is sharing our story, because we tend to be competitors, and so then we tend not to talk about what we really do. We're all very proud of our products, and consumers want our products, but we don't share that story about, you know, what was the process to get there, but also who are partners within that. I think being authentic, there is a reality that we deal in live animals, and there's a process that happens, and we shouldn't be ashamed that that animal is processed in a humane manner. The meat industry is one of the most heavily regulated industries in Canada, and so I think that we tend to shy away from questions because we're scared to say, yeah, you know, this is what I do. I process hogs, I process beef, I process sheep, and then we turn it into fantastic products that you want to eat on the store shelves. I think the other piece is because we're silent on those things and we don't always come forward and be more bold about it, we tend to let the consumer believe that the retailer makes our products. You know, there was a poll out just a little while ago that we were engaged on for a different association, and it indicated that those between the ages of 18 and 25 actually believe that a Safeway or another store, that they actually make meat. Like, they put it on the shelf, it comes like that, and they provided that to you. Not the producer, not us. And that's a challenge. That means we haven't done a good enough job. And then the last one I would say is probably very much in line with what John has said, and probably very much in line with my other two colleagues, is a united voice. We're, you know, it's like a three-legged stool. You know, if we're not all in this together, and if we're bashing each other and taking each other down to promote a product, that doesn't work. We're doing more damage. You know, it takes years and years and years to build trust, but it only takes one event to eliminate it. And you ruin it for the whole industry, not just one sector. So I think that having a united voice when we're talking about really difficult issues, you know, humane treatment of animals, front of package labeling, you know, those kind of conversations are really important when we can unite and talk about how healthy and how our products are processed or handled on farm. There's no reason why we should be at odds with each other on any one of those issues.
Thanks, Carrie. Jen?
Thanks so much. I think my colleagues on the stage have covered off so many things that I was thinking, and I'm not sure if you could see me nodding along. But I think, you know, I can't stress enough that idea of the united front, and it's a space that sometimes is uncomfortable for the supply chain, because in so many other instances, there's things that are competitive, and we have to be very careful about those things. But then there are these, you know, things that happen across the whole value chain that really do better the entire chain, where we can be a little stronger. I think the other thing to keep in mind is, you know, I think companies, Walmart specifically, I'll use ourselves as an example, we're getting more comfortable with sort of saying, here's what we're doing, we know there's more work to do. And it's that acknowledgement that there's more work to do. You've got to start somewhere. And, you know, my colleagues always hear me say, I'd rather get most of the way there than not do anything at all. And I think it's that acknowledgement and realization that it's okay. You've got to start somewhere. You've got to progress. And as long as there's that commitment and drive to continuous improvement, and that you're transparent about it, I think people appreciate that. Speaks to that authenticity. And then the other thing is just figuring out what's the message, what's the right message for the consumer. There's too much information that can be overwhelming, but what's that balance that gives them the comfort and assurance that they need, with supporting documentation that can be, you know, further sought out if needed? Because again, we are very sensitive to our brands, to the claims being made. We want to make sure that anything we're putting on pack is something we can substantiate. And just speaking from a Walmart perspective, one thing I think the industry's done a really good job of is that made in Canada messaging. So I think based on some of the things that we've done and seen, consumers really do galvanize around that. And it's a very consistent message across the entire supply chain and across retailers that really does resonate. So that's, you know, we could maybe take a page out of the made in Canada or grown in Canada playbook and figure out how do we kind of continue that with other messaging.
Andrea?
Well, you all said what I was going to say, but yeah, I think when I thought about this question, you know, I think that collaboration piece is definitely at the core of everything that we do at the CRSB. And I mean, one of the things I haven't talked much about, but since John mentioned third-party assurance systems, you know, we've built one for the beef industry, and really the objectives are threefold: to recognize those sustainable practices at the farm level, at the processing level, to pull that product through the chain, enable companies like Walmart and some of these big folks that want to share that story with the consumers, and then kind of facilitate that messaging to build the trust that John was talking about. And I think too, where we found a lot of success is partnering with some of our third-party organizations, third-party NGOs like Ducks Unlimited Canada, you know, building that credibility so it's not, you know, the beef or the pork industry saying we are doing a good job, but having some, you know, of those other influencers and amplifiers to share that story. And because John and I both sit on the communications committee for the National Index for Agri-Food Performance, I thought I would mention that too. And that is, again, the measuring piece, that's the backbone, and then the assurance, and then the communication. And the communication, it's hard and it's complex, and we know our systems are complex, and drilling it down into a simple message that the consumers that recognize they don't know much, but they want to know more, it's a lot harder than it sounds.
But it's worth it. What did Eric say? A $30 billion swing? I mean, that's a tremendous amount of impact from getting the message and doing the right thing. Okay, I'll turn it over to the floor and see if there's any questions. I'll see how many questions. Phil.
Yeah, thank you, Dory. My question is to the panel, and this is a ever-evolving question that we have as primary producers. But my question is, and like you've stated, Dory, I may already know the answer, but I guess I'm going to ask the question anyway. So, in so much as the context of what you've been saying today, can you address the issue with how much of this messaging is being utilized by companies for market share and for their benefit, in so much as that we have seen certain companies utilize this platform to elevate their position and their sales? I guess that's the crux of the question.
Who wants to start? Start with Jen.
Sure, I'm not in the room. Pass it to me. No, I'm definitely happy to chat about it. I think that's an area where it's sort of, I have two sort of sides of this story. So one, I actually think that there's a lot of companies that are working in this space, whether it's sustainability or the people component of regeneration or any other, that aren't necessarily telling their stories. And so one thing I'll say about Walmart, we're doing quite a bit behind the scenes that we don't necessarily talk about. And we're doing it because it's the right thing to do and we're on this path of regeneration. But it's also because the messaging is difficult, and you want to make sure, and we want to make sure, that we're able to substantiate anything that we would say publicly about that. Having said that, I do think that in order for us to see the industry grow, you do have to sort of stick a stake in the ground, so to speak, and say, this is what we're looking for. And we're starting to look for these things, because without the demand, the supply won't necessarily follow in all cases. So it's a little bit of a two-sided. In some cases, I think people aren't talking about it enough. And in some cases, I do think that it's being used as an industry leader in some way, shape, or form. I'm not sure if that answers your question or if that's the answer that you already knew, but not sure if anyone on the stage wanted to add anything.
Anybody else?
I could maybe just add, just from our own experience with this roundtable approach, and you know, we've got companies like Walmart, like McDonald's, like, you know, some of these big companies that probably you're thinking are benefiting, but you know, that collaborative approach, and we've talked about it a lot today, you know, bringing everybody together and deciding on the common vision, and it's not some of these big companies sort of trying to tell you what to do, but trying to create the, you know, what are the things and the practices and the outcomes really that we want across the board. And I know I can speak only for the CRSP program, but it's really about creating that system that would be seen across Canada in different places, and so that a consumer can go to a restaurant or a retail store or a fast food outlet or any one of those places, or the butcher shop, and if they see that same mark, then they kind of know what it means, and then it means the same thing across the board, and then it's kind of all been developed. And they might not know all of the intricacies of what went into developing those standards and processes, but kind of that's the dream of of the assurance program, is that it would mean the same thing to everybody.
Go ahead.
Just a really quick comment. One of the things that we found in our 2022 research is we asked Canadians about sustainability claims, and they are very conscious of greenwashing. So if a company is making statements about sustainability that are broad-based and not backed up by anything, the consumer's going to pick up on it. They also don't necessarily believe that throwing a sustainability sticker on a label makes a product any more believable. So companies that are making these statements have to be really careful that they're walking the walk and not just talking the talk.
So that's exactly where I was going to go. From a processing sector, the reality of it is that the consumer, they dig. And so the minute that you make that claim, they're going to look for the backup to that claim. So while there may be some companies who are more vocal about the things they're doing, I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. Like to your example about McDonald's, you see CRSB on McDonald's trucks traveling across Canada, on all of their stores, on their packaging, all of that sort of thing. That just better educates. And so then when we, as Canadian Meat Council members, also use that same product, we can also catapult off of that. And I think that's a good thing. But I do think that if somebody once said, well, I can just put the sustainability sticker on it and then we're good and everybody will think I'm just one of the rest. No, the consumer doesn't operate like that, and they'll call you out in about 5 seconds. And with the access to social media anymore, you just don't have that ability. You're going to be held to account. But I also don't think that we should be scared to not have a full sustainability plan before coming forward, because sometimes you have to take the leap and say, we're going to make the effort to be more sustainable, and you might not be able to give a date given the type of company that you are. But taking that action step puts everybody on notice, and they can start holding your feet to the fire. That's not necessarily a bad thing. So I wouldn't necessarily say that every time somebody makes a sustainability claim that it's just a claim. It might just be the first step in many.
I would just maybe add one thing to that, on that kind of same tack, that I think we know sort of the average consumer. They might be looking for some of those claims and some of those marks. I would say the average probably doesn't dig too far into the details around it, but they have to be there. So people don't necessarily want to hear the science, but we have to make sure that anything that we do, whether it's an assurance system or our benchmarking and the metrics and connecting those things with people's ESG commitments and all of that, really has to be rooted in science to be credible.
I think just one more thing on that is the increased investor focus or investor interest. So many of us would have ESG reports that are publicly disclosed. And again, it's for those exact reasons, building trust and transparency, and trying to support the things that we're saying and again, build that trust throughout the system.
Got time for one more quick question, if anyone's got one. Catherine?
Hi, thank you. I'm the Executive Director of Agriculture in the Classroom, Manitoba. So we work with the future action takers and the future choice makers and impact makers. And so I'm wondering, what do you hope they know when they graduate so that they could make, better choices, better impact, bigger impact on sustainability?
I'll start if that's okay.
Go, Jen.
As a parent, Sorry, I was going to say, as a parent, I think about this one quite a lot. And I know there's a lot of talk specifically, about financial literacy and how do we enable our children to make great financial decisions. The same way that we're talking about needing to integrate more of the financial learning, I really do think that we need to set our children and our youth up to make and understand what they're seeing from a sustainability and regeneration perspective, and have the tools in their toolbox to ask those good questions as adults and to make those, better, more informed decisions. And I really do think almost like sustainability literacy needs to be integrated into schools. And I don't think it should be attributed to one company or one process or one certification. I think it needs to be that very general knowledge base that basically says ask questions, dig into it, get those basics foundations. And I mean, I think I have a 6-year-old and I literally think about it all the time. And when I'm at home trying to show her and tell her why I'm choosing X over Y, and trying to be as, take away as much bias as I can, but it's what we do. So there's a little bit of bias in there, but definitely something that I think is important for sure.
So, wow, this is a loaded question. But I appreciate it. I think there's lots of things you want them to know. Some of them are more personal for me, and then some of them I'll give you from a or from a CMC perspective. The first one is I would just really love every Canadian child to come out of school, whether you're urban or rural, and actually know where their food comes from. This is such a frustrating idea to me that there's this divide between rural and urban Canadians that says that rural knows where their food comes from, we hope, but urbanites don't. And we can eliminate that, especially as we talk about hunger, as we talk about food shortages, as we talk of sustainability, as we talk about humane caring for animals. These are just, for me, basics, just as a general human. So there's that piece. The second piece I would like to see is I would like to see a real effort to put more agriculture in the classroom. So I applaud what you're doing, but we're not seeing it in every classroom. And I think there needs to be a larger effort on what are the opportunities in agriculture and agri-food. I've been with Safina for 8 years, but previous to that, even though I grew up in rural central Alberta, even though as a producer, I knew nothing about food processing. I had no idea of the job opportunities. And we still hear people talk about food processing as low-skilled, low labor, and just anybody can do it. That is not the case. That is not the case at all. A lot of them are high-skilled, mostly unionized processing plants. You can be in research and development, nutrition. The world's your oyster kind of thing. So I would like to see more emphasis on that, and certainly that's a passion of mine as well. And then probably the last biggest thing is for we as a society to understand that everybody should have the ability to grow the food, to process the food, and sell the food, and that matrix, whether it includes profits or in some years losses, is not a bad thing. And that not a single one of us in this room, and I cannot believe that people on purpose would harm their animals or harm their product to sell to a consumer. And I would like to see that these young kids come up with that belief that we live in a solid Canadian food system that has the proper regulations in place, that allows for the safe consumption of that food and for the humane handling of those animals and the humane care for those animals. I don't think that's a hard message to get into schools. I'm baffled at why it seems so hard, but I don't think those are hard messages to get into our schools. And I think if you did that, you could almost change a generation.
Andrea, you got?
Well, I 100% agree with all of that. And I was just going to say, I mean, obviously programs like Ag in the Classroom have been doing tons and tons of work. All great stuff. I mean, I think getting, and consumers and kids and parents are all bombarded with so much information, and so much of it conflicts. And so I would love to see in the next generation for them to leave school when they graduate all getting consistent information, and that is, go back and it's that science-based, and it's based on fact and accuracy and transparency and all of those things that we've been talking about. And I think even going one step further and getting it into the education programs that are teaching the teachers to teach the kids would be amazing.
John, you want to close it?
Close it in a little different direction. And I agree with everything I heard, and my big thing is to have children leave school and try to be able to discern what is proper information and what is misinformation. One of the things that we didn't talk about today is the ability to get someone else to tell your story. And there was a really neat piece that Health Canada did, and they wanted to do a story on the dangers of vaping. They had the resources to tell their own story. What they did was they went to a group of YouTube influencers named Answer in Progress. These are 3 or 4 young people who do a really neat job of telling a story, and they have over 1 million followers on YouTube. Health Canada engaged them to do a video on the dangers of vaping and aimed at younger people. I think to date that video has seen 5 million views. So that is a creative way to get a message across that we may not think about. Had Health Canada done that on their own, chances are it would have fell flat. But because they engaged someone outside the sector who looked at it with different eyes and were able to tell a story, it hit the ball. And having Ag in the Classroom and other organizations like that tell our story is an important piece too.
Well, I think we've hit our time limit, but I trust that you'll agree with me that the panel has been not as informative, but engaging and passionate. There is no doubt that all of these 4 people are believe in the importance of building that trust. They are a position of influence to make sure we can get it on the right path, and they also will deliver. So join me in thanking all 4 of them for an excellent panel.